If you want to understand what is changing in this war, do not start with the loudest headline. Start with the map. Because the most important question is not whether the USS Gerald Ford ran away. There's no verified public evidence for that. The real question is why America's newest and most expensive aircraft carrier changed position the way it did, why that movement matters, and what it tells us about the kind of war the United States is now fighting against Iran. In early March, official U.S. military imagery showed the Ford conducting flight operations in support of Operation Epic Fury in the eastern Mediterranean, and then transiting the Suez Canal on March 5th on its way into the Middle East theater. A week later, after a non-combat fire on board, U.S. Naval Forces Central Command said the ship remained fully operational in the Red Sea. That is not the picture of a carrier fleeing in panic. It is the picture of a carrier being repositioned inside a rapidly changing battle space. That matters because aircraft carriers are not just floating airfields. They are political messages, logistics hubs, strike platforms, air defense nodes, and symbols of escalation all at once. The Gerald Ford is the lead ship of its class, the first new U.S. carrier design in more than 40 years. Official Navy material describes it as capable of carrying 75-plus aircraft, operating at 30-plus knots, and supporting a total crew, air wing, and staff of roughly 4,139. Its mission is forward crisis response and sustained strike operations. In cost terms, public U.S. acquisition documents and Navy reporting have long put the ship itself at roughly $13 billion plus, which is why so many headlines reduce it to America's $13 billion carrier. That framing is not wrong, but it can be misleading if it makes people think the ship's main value is prestige. In a war like this, its real value is flexibility, how fast it can generate sorties, shift air power, absorb risk, and project presence without relying on land bases. So why move it at all? Because geography in this conflict is strategy. When the Ford was photographed supporting Operation Epic Fury in the eastern Mediterranean on March 2nd, it was already contributing to the war effort from a position west of the Levant. But by March 5th, U.S. military imagery showed it transiting the Suez Canal, a move that places the carrier much closer to the Red Sea and to the southern approaches of the broader Iran theater. That southbound move did not prove weakness. In fact, in one sense, it suggested the opposite, a willingness to bring major naval air power closer to the operating area. But it also exposed something important. The United States is fighting a conflict in which proximity helps strike efficiency. Yet proximity also increases exposure to a much wider menu of asymmetric threats that carriers usually face in peacetime signaling missions. That tension between operational advantage and risk concentration is the real story behind the carrier's movement. And that is where a lot of commentary goes off the rails. People hear carrier moved and immediately jump to one of two extremes. Either they say the ship was charging into battle to prove dominance, or they say it was forced to turn around because America blinked. Neither claim is supported by the public record you gave me. What the record actually shows is more complicated and more interesting. The Ford went from supporting operations in the eastern Mediterranean to operating in the Red Sea during a period when the U.S. was expanding strikes, when the Strait of Hormuz was becoming a central global concern, and when Iran's retaliatory campaign was widening across the region. That suggests the carrier's position was being adjusted for mission requirements inside a dynamic theater, not for a single cinematic moment. In real military operations, ships of this size move for layered reasons at once: sortie geometry, tanker support, escort availability, logistics strain, adversary range envelopes, and the need to keep options open. Now here is the part that makes the phrase kill zone emotionally powerful, but analytically sloppy. Iran does not need to sink a U.S. aircraft carrier to change how that carrier operates. It only needs to create enough credible danger around the carrier's operating environment that American planners start balancing offensive opportunity against defensive burden. And that burden is not theoretical. Multiple current reports describe Iran's threats and operations around the Strait of Hormuz, including attacks or threats involving drones, missiles, naval mining, ports, and shipping. AP described Trump calling on countries to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz as Iranian strikes disrupted traffic and pushed oil prices above $100 a barrel. CENTCOM separately warned civilians to avoid ports used by Iranian forces. The issue is not only whether Iran can hit a carrier directly, it is whether Iran can create such a dense web of missile, drone, mine, and maritime risk that protecting the carrier and everything around it becomes a strategic task in itself. That changes how a carrier is used. In lower risk environments, a supercarrier is a tool of concentration. Pack air power close, launch heavily, dominate the tempo, dare the other side to respond. In a threat-saturated environment, a carrier becomes a tool of managed exposure. Still potent, still central, but employed with much more caution about where exactly it sits, how long it lingers, what escort posture surrounds it, and what kind of targeting picture the adversary might build. That does not mean the ship is ineffective. It means its value becomes partly dependent on staying survivable long enough to matter. And survivability is not just about armor or interceptors. It is about distance, deception, route choices, timing, air defense layering, and refusing to sit where the enemy wants you to sit. If Iran can compress U.S. decision space with drones, missiles, and shipping threats, then every move the carrier makes starts to say something about how Washington is weighing risk against reach. There is also a second layer here that is easy to miss: logistics. The public likes to think war is mainly about platforms, carriers, bombers, destroyers, missile batteries. But campaigns are often shaped more by sustainment than by spectacle. Fuel, munitions, maintenance, repair cycles, crew fatigue, and flight deck tempo all matter. And the Ford is not entering this war as a freshly assembled showpiece. Reporting in recent days has described it as being on a very long deployment, with strains showing up in onboard systems and maintenance pressure. The Washington Post reported that the ship suffered a fire in its laundry space on March 12th, injuring 2 sailors, and described the carrier as being under serious deployment strain. The official NavCent statement confirmed the fire was not combat-related. The ship's propulsion was unaffected, and it remained fully operational. That matters because it cuts against any simplistic claim that a sudden move must have been caused by enemy action alone. In a real campaign, operational geometry and platform wear are often intertwined. That is why the Suez Transit matters so much symbolically. The Suez Canal is not just a shipping lane in this story, it is a hinge point between theaters. When the Ford moved south through it on March 5th, the United States was effectively shifting the carrier from a posture of support from the eastern Mediterranean toward a more direct Middle East operating role. That move shortened distances to key areas, improved the carrier's relevance to Red Sea and Gulf-adjacent contingencies, and made its presence part of the broader contest over whether the U.S. could keep maritime and air operations functioning under Iranian pressure. Seen that way, the Ford did not leave a kill zone. It entered a more consequential zone, but one where operating too aggressively could also produce higher strategic risk. That is the paradox. The closer the carrier gets to the heart of the conflict, the more useful it becomes, but also the more carefully it must be used. And the maritime context around it has only become more dangerous. AP's current coverage says the U.S. has been calling for help to reopen the Strait of Hormuz amid Iranian strikes and shipping disruption. Other reporting highlights that allies have been hesitant about direct military involvement in escorting or clearing the route. That matters for carrier operations, because a carrier does not fight in a vacuum. It fights inside a network of destroyers, support vessels, aircraft, ISR assets, and political commitments. If the U.S. is asking other countries to help secure shipping, that tells you the battle space is broad enough that even a carrier strike group is only one piece of the puzzle. A supercarrier can generate enormous combat power, but it cannot single-handedly solve regional mine risk, escort every tanker, defend every allied port, and still remain perfectly postured for continuous high-intensity air operations. The more the war spreads into commercial choke points, the more every military asset has to be assigned priorities. This is where the title you brought me gets close to a real insight, but overshoots uncertainty. The terrifying reason is not that the Ford just left the kill zone. The terrifying reason is that modern great power assets can no longer assume they can sit wherever they want in a missile and drone-saturated regional war without incurring major strategic trade-offs. That is more serious than a clickbait version, because it means the problem is structural. Iran may not need to destroy America's biggest symbols of power. It may only need to turn them into high-maintenance, high-risk, high-protection assets, whose freedom of action is narrower than Washington would like to admit. That is exactly why the carrier's location matters so much. Every mile it moves reflects a judgment about exposure, tempo, and credibility. And in a war where the information environment is chaotic, those movements are read as signals by allies, adversaries, markets, and domestic audiences all at once. There is a market dimension to this too. Bloomberg's coverage has repeatedly tied the war to oil price spikes, shipping disruption, and growing anxiety over global supply chains. If the Ford is moved in a way that suggests the U.S. is leaning harder into reopening threatened maritime routes, markets may read that as determination. If it is moved in a way that suggests caution or defensive spacing, markets may read that as evidence of threat density. The ship is therefore not only a military asset, but also a market signal. This matters because the war's economic consequences are no longer hypothetical. Bloomberg described oil rising above $100 during the second week of the Iran war. And AP has framed the Strait of Hormuz as central to those fears. A carrier's position, then, is not just about combat effectiveness. It becomes part of the wider perception battle over whether the U.S. can keep the region's energy arteries functioning under fire. Another reason the carrier's movement matters is what it says about land-based dependence. One of the core strategic advantages of an aircraft carrier is that it lets the United States project air power without relying entirely on host nation bases. That matters in a region where governments may be supportive in private, cautious in public, and deeply nervous about becoming direct battlefield nodes. A carrier gives Washington options when regional politics are fragile. But a carrier is not a magical substitute for land infrastructure either. It still depends on refueling, escorts, supply chains, and space to maneuver. If the war is stretching from Iran to Gulf infrastructure, to Iraqi insecurity, to port warnings, to pressure in the Hormuz corridor, then the carrier becomes a way to reduce one vulnerability while remaining exposed to others. In other words, it is an instrument of flexibility, not invulnerability. That distinction is central to understanding the Ford's role. We also have to be careful not to confuse absence of public detail with proof of disaster. Much of the online conversation around carrier movements depends on map speculation, partial imagery, and dramatic narrative filling. But the official record you provided is actually pretty clear on a few points. CENTCOM imagery placed the Ford in support operations in the eastern Mediterranean on March 2nd. Official imagery then placed it in the Suez Canal on March 5th. NAVCENT said on March 12th that after the onboard fire, the carrier remained fully operational in the Red Sea. Those are three hard markers. They do not tell us every tactical reason for every subsequent movement, but they do tell us the ship was neither publicly shown as destroyed nor described by U.S. authorities as crippled or in retreat. For a fact-checked script, that means we should not build a narrative of combat withdrawal that public sources do not support. That does not make the story less dramatic. It makes it more believable. Because the believable version is this: the United States moved one of its most important naval assets deeper into a war zone, not because the risks were low, but because the stakes were rising. Then, once there, the carrier had to operate inside an environment shaped by Iranian maritime threats, regional strike spillover, shipping disruption, and the broader battle over who controls escalation in and around Hormuz. In that context, any later repositioning would not necessarily mean retreat. It could mean preserving the carrier for the missions only a carrier can do, instead of letting the ship become a fixed, overexposed symbol. Military planners do not get rewarded for proving bravery on social media. They get rewarded for keeping assets alive and useful long enough to shape the outcome. There is also the issue of replacement and force management. Reporting has suggested the USS George H.W. Bush is expected to relieve the Ford after this unusually long deployment. That matters because if Washington is already thinking in terms of rotation, relief, and maintenance strain, then any carrier movement needs to be read against that larger force management picture. A ship can move because it is evading risk, because it is maximizing mission effectiveness, because it is making room for relief forces, or because all three are true at once. The public often wants one clean answer. War rarely gives one. A carrier strike group is the product of operational need, readiness cycles, allied messaging, domestic politics, and adversary pressure all interacting simultaneously. That is why one headline cannot capture it. The Ford's movement is not a single emotional event. It is a military decision nested inside a campaign that is still changing by the day. And that is what makes the current moment genuinely unsettling. Not the fantasy that America's biggest carrier suddenly panicked and fled. Not the opposite fantasy that it can sit anywhere with zero consequences. The unsettling reality is narrower and more plausible. The U.S. still has overwhelming naval power, but even overwhelming power must now be managed more carefully in this theater than old assumptions would suggest. Iran's tools, especially in maritime disruption, drones, and missile-based threat projection, do not have to outperform the U.S. Navy platform for platform. They only have to complicate American freedom of maneuver enough to force constant recalculation. And once that starts happening, each movement of a major ship becomes strategically meaningful, even if the public never gets the full classified logic behind it. So what is the strongest safe conclusion? It is this. The public record supports saying the Gerald R. Ford moved from supporting Operation Epic Fury in the eastern Mediterranean into the Red Sea, where it remained operational even after a non-combat fire. It does not support saying it was definitively withdrawn from a kill zone by enemy action. But the movement still reveals something important. It reveals that the U.S. is trying to position maximum naval air power close enough to matter while avoiding the trap of letting a high-value asset become unnecessarily exposed in a conflict where maritime, missile, and drone threats are tightly intertwined. That is the real reason this story is worth your audience's attention. Not because it proves collapse or panic, but because it shows how even the most formidable platforms in the world are now being used under new constraints in a very dangerous war. And maybe that is the best way to end it. The USS Gerald R. Ford is still a symbol of American power, but in this war, it is also a symbol of something else, the end of easy assumptions. Easy assumptions that a carrier can always sit wherever politics demands. Easy assumptions that shipping lanes can be secured by declarations alone. easy assumptions that proximity automatically equals strength. What the carrier's movement suggests instead is a harder truth. In modern war, the most powerful force is not always the one that looks most dramatic on a map. It is the one that can stay effective while constantly adapting to a threat environment that keeps changing faster than public narratives can keep up. That is why the Ford moved. Not to act out a headline, but to stay useful in a war where usefulness now depends on surviving the geography as much as mastering it.